Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl. Welcome to Get Used to It. As you know, Get Used to It devotes itself to bringing information about people in the gay and lesbian community or issues in that community, but of course not only for that community. And today we have a real treat. What you were looking at under the credits is the Great Wall of Los Angeles, a set of murals, and we're going to talk to the artist director, the founder of the organization that helped put this together, a woman with a long history in art and history in Los Angeles. She is an artist herself. She is the founder of SPARC, which she'll tell you what it stands for because she just told me, and of course it's Social and Political Art Resource Center
right.
in Los Angeles. She's also a professor at UCLA. Judy Baca, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Really happy that you're here.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things that people are always interested in is kind of how do people begin getting interested in the things that then shape their lives? So tell me a little bit about your family, your background, your growing up, your relatives, caregivers, whatever. How'd you start?
Well, it's hard to tell, it's really hard to tell what was the moment that made me the artist. But I can tell you that my grandparents, Teodoro and Francisca Baca, came in the first wave of the migrations from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution through what we call the Ellis Island of the Southwest, El Paso. And they went north on the Santa Fe Trail, as hundreds of thousands of other people did at that time. And they ended up in a little town facing Kansas at the base of the Purgatory River in the freezing cold called La Junta, the junction, where my grandfather was going north toward the Luisa Maria Baca land grant, which in my research I have not quite established our connection to, but when I do, it'll mean that we own Denver.
Wouldn't that be nice? That would be terrific.
And they settled there because my great-grandfather was already there. And that family, this whole family, my mother was born in La Junta, Colorado, and this tiny little town, which was a very segregated town, a very rough place, very cold. And my grandfather went to work for the railroad. In Mexico, he owned a ranch and a commissary. They called it a commissary. And Pancho Villa wanted his commissary, and he wanted his roots to the north so he could bring equipment and materials and food products for the revolution. And my grandfather didn't believe in war. So I think somewhere in that is the roots of my own activism, and also they were a musical family. So there was lots of talk about people, the whole family having a piano around the wood-burning stove, and my uncles all played in the local bands. They actually had their own band, and they went from town to town playing. And so I think there was a musical group. And my mother tells stories about how on the side of the stove in this little house with no electricity and no running water, my uncle would draw beautiful drawings of gorgeous figurations of Indians and sort of mestizo characters with white chalk on the black stove. So I think actually there's probably artists lurking back there.
I think there's a gene in there somewhere, maybe.
So.
Well, I really think that could be the case, because although I'm really a nurture over nature kind of person, still, sometimes there's just some talent in there, and you certainly have such a great deal of talent. There had to be something in there.
I think it came from, I think maybe it transfers from being musicians to being visual artists. But we came from a family of singers, of performers, and very likely that at a family gathering somebody was performing.
And where did you grow up?
My mother brought us all, about the Bacas, to California right after the war, right toward the end of the war. Her brothers had been had enlisted into the World War II, and she was left trying to find a job and to deal with the family there. And it was hard for her to get a job in this region, and for her to get a job that was well-paying and so forth. So she came to California at 18, which I really think actually was the beginning of feminism, right? The idea of a Latina, a Chicana, leaving her family and going to California so far away by herself was outrageous. It's not something she would have let me do at 18, right?
Right.
And she came to work in Los Angeles, and that's where I was born. I was born in South Central Los Angeles, and my first memories were at 85th and Central in what is now known as Watts. And at that time, it was a Black and Latino community also.
So growing up, going to school in LA, did you know you were an artist? I mean, so a lot of times kids who are taken with the arts are really sort of the outsiders in their school. They either are proud of that or they just are. And sometimes it's difficult to find your way as an artist in school.
I've met a few of these kinds of children, the children that I was. And now as an art teacher, as a person who actually supports the development of other artists, I can see myself in some of them. I was a straight arrow from the arts from the very beginning. It was the passion and the love. I just loved being able to spend hours by myself making drawings and paintings. And when we left South Central, and I was living with my mother and my grandmother and my aunt Delia, who was educatively handicapped and was about 5 years old in her development. So she was sort of a giant playmate. My aunt, who was a ranchera singer, she always had this gorgeous voice and was always singing, and a glamorous girl. And my mother, who worked in the Goodyear tire factory. My mother met a man, fell in love, and married an Italian, and we moved to the San Fernando Valley. And that was going to make us upwardly mobile.
Of course. And
it was suburbia. And there I entered school, and actually we ended up in a place called Pacoima. I think they made a little bit of a mistake, but the truth was that at that time the redlining, the districts were determined about where people would live, and the covenant laws were still in place. So they ended up in a Black and Latino community, which was how properties were transferred. And it wasn't until I did the research for the Great Wall that I understood why the Laurel Canyon, for example, was a dividing line between the two communities. And in Pacoima, I went to Haddon Avenue Elementary School. Today, it's 99% Spanish-speaking children. At that time, Spanish was not allowed on the school grounds.
Right.
So I was having a language transfer in the home and in school. And I think it made me a kind of silent child. And in school, I had the great fortune of having a kindergarten teacher and a principal who I still remember very well, Mrs. Burton. And they named the part of the school after her, who I recited Humpty Dumpty in English to so that I could get into school. She said, "Does she speak English?" And my mother said, set me up on the counter, and I said, "Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall." Humpty Dumpty had a great fall.
It's an interesting choice, actually, when you think about it. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again.
Right. And so I got into school, and I had this wonderful teacher who let me paint. And I still have vivid memories of the shiny tin cans with tempera paint and the beautiful newsprint that I could paint on. And my mother kept those paintings. I think they're probably just little flakes, but they were good. I mean, they were interesting. Everybody thought they were interesting paintings, and I could have been content painting forever. And I think about elementary school, the moments of those sort of important art projects in which a teacher decided that, for example, we were going to learn about Holstein cows, and I got to make a cow and paint one, or the Boston Tea Party, in which we made a mural. And so I sort of marked the time.
Your first mural?
I did my first mural in elementary school.
Wow.
I think of that when I work with children now. I think, I have no idea of the importance of this.
Well, it seems to me that's one of the great losses,
Yes.
where at least in our schools in California, we don't have art and music really as a standard thing in the public schools anymore. And everybody kind of remembers. I took one art class when I was in college, and I actually still have the drawing that I made because I thought,
please, they're precious.
Gee, I like this.
It's precious.
I like this, and I did it.
I think we all know, those of us who have done any kind of education and have any education in how people learn, we know that people learn in different ways. And for example, the children who are visual learners, as I was. Even when I was in college, I was a character that not only read the book, but in a sense visualized the pages. So that when I was sitting down to do a test, I was rereading what I had taken pictures of in my head. And we know also that other children understand by virtue of creating a movement and then remembering because of the movement, and they're more kinetic. We know that other children are much more verbal, and they come through language is how they hear that. But I was a child that from the very beginning understood everything through sight.
Well, it's it's interesting because you can have a penchant for expressing yourself in the plastic arts, but that still means that you have to have something to say. And I think what's characterized your work, it's not just all art is a personal expression, but yours has been so much more about social activism and social justice. Where do you think that came from?
Well, that's easier to trace, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of both my grandmother and my mother. My grandmother was a person who practiced healing, and she did it through prayer. She was a very religious woman who looked like a very indigenous person. I mean, she really looked like an Apache, long braids. And I remember walking down the street with her in the San Fernando Valley with her carrying a parasol, and that we were really quite a sight. I mean, people were thinking we just stepped off the reservation or something. And not me, because I was always fair and light-skinned and greenish eyes. But Francisca used herbal medicine. She grew exactly what we needed for the teas and for compounds that would like take swelling out. I mean, you could always go to Francisca and she had a remedy, and she would know exactly which remedy to use. And other people depended on her, and she could see. I remember the first thing in the morning, every morning, was her telling us about her dreams. And I loved hearing about her dreams, but then I sort of came to dread them because sometimes the dreams had a determination of what I could do or not do. Right. I dreamt that you would fall and therefore you can't go. Right.
I see.
So you're right, so it was a controlling thing. But I think actually the notion of like living in two realms, the realm of the real and the unreal, or the subconscious and the conscious, was what I learned from her. And that also beginning to see how people felt and hearing and learning kind of empathic listening, I learned from my grandmother. And my mother, because of her experiences in a segregated city and a little town in Colorado that was quite brutal in terms of a segregation in the schools, Mexicans couldn't go into certain stores, couldn't ride on the buses except in the back. It was very much like the Deep South. I finally had the great experience of taking my mother to the theater that she couldn't sit anywhere but the balcony in her little town, her hometown. When I did the piece for Denver, I did a piece for Denver International Airport that tells the story of my family's migration. And it's a 50-foot piece in the Denver International Airport.
How wonderful.
And at the same time, we went back to reclaim my grandfather's grave, which had been allowed to go to seed because all of the graveyard was maintained except for the Mexican graves.
Right.
And my mother went back to high school reunion and began this process of the reclamation of her father's grave, and was outraged. But it would be Hortensia that would be outraged. It would be her that would say, this is not right. And she would report to the federal authorities about the fact that Mexicans couldn't, soldiers, for example, once they were enlisted in the military, then the federal government became interested in the fact that they were segregated in certain restaurants and in certain facilities. And in fact, it happened here. I remember Roy Ball telling me this amazing story about around the time of his retirement. And he was a city councilman, and he came back from World War II and a veteran. And they set a veterans office out in front of City Hall in Los Angeles, and the veterans could come and claim their $500 and the right to buy a house. In other words, they could get a $500 down payment for a house. And when he went to get it, they said to him, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't give it to Mexicans."
Wow.
And he said to the woman who was sitting at the counter, come over here. And he pointed out the window and he said, "See that car down there?" And it had an E license plate on it. He said, "That's my car. I'm Councilman Roy Ball." And interestingly enough, his family is from the same little place that my grandfather bought property, the only place they could buy property, across the tracks along the Arkansas River in a place called La Junta.
And his daughter is now a member of Congress.
That's right. So, you know, there's relatives in that. My mother's best friend was a
Well, to some extent it does say to you, I mean, one of the interesting things too is the theme that you chose. And I want to talk about the Great Wall because of the young people that it involved and how that came about. But just the theme of history and the theme of inclusion, in a way it's a very American thing.
It is.
You know, when you look at all of our families, like they say, we came here on different ships, but we're in the same boat now.
Right.
Because a lot of the stories are very similar of exclusion and, you know, in older times before your family migrated here, when other white European families came, there was still a hierarchy.
Yes.
You know, I mean, the Irish were here, the Italians were here, the Jews, of course, were here, and it was, it's always been a kind of a hierarchy, and yet people somehow, you know, we permeate through to each other and somehow permeate out. And then there's always a new immigrant class that you turn around and say, there was a, John Steinbeck's last book was called America and the Americans, and also had some wonderful photographs in it. And he wrote that he bet that the first guy that jumped off the Mayflower onto Plymouth Rock turned around and said, okay, this is my country, the rest of you foreigners go back home.
I think that's exactly it. I think there's such an incredible, I think perhaps my fascination with history begins with the fact that we, as Americans, have the shortest memories. And not only maybe because our country is so young, maybe because we have no respect for anything that came before us, that history begins when we walk in the door and it ends with us.
Right.
And that's how I got really interested in this concept, which I think also is a very indigenous concept, maybe one that I learned from my grandmother, I learned from my own roots, which has to do with the fact that almost everyone in the world, whatever culture they're from, believes somehow that memory is embedded in place. And that if you can learn to listen, if you can put your ear to the ground somehow, you begin to have the capacity to see, you can experience something of that moment, the moment of history that occurred in the place. And that's why we take these pilgrimages. That's why we go to places and we, for example, go to Gettysburg and to have the sense of what happened during the Civil War. So I think my work has been about memory, the memory of the land and of the people. And in a sense, because I am from Los Angeles, so I'm an Angelito, so deeply ingrained, one of the few, I think, in our city. We seem to be a disappearing group, and I grew up alongside of the river. I mean, I watched the rivers be concreted as a child. And in a sense, the disappearance of the river was like the hardening of the arteries of the land. And in the sense that the nutrients that were carried through those arteries that sort of went back into the aquifer, and the movement of, or the people who lived along the river were very easy to disappear thereafter. In other words, you disappear the river first, and then you disappear the stories of the people. And so as I started to excavate the stories of the people of Los Angeles, it was a fascinating story, and one that just became an endless narrative. Of course, I had no idea in 1976 that it would be over half of my life, that I would be working with hundreds of young people, some 14 through 21-year-old kids, over 400 of them, to paint this narrative that's a half a mile long now.
Well, let's go back just a little bit. I know, you know, high school, college, doing art. How did Spark start?
How Spark got sparked?
How did Spark get sparked? Because that's really been the center of this activity, and the center really of your social activism, art connection, and the community.
Yes, absolutely. In about 1974, I was working for the city. I was a city employee, and I became an artist that worked in the parks on what was one of the great work projects called the Sita Program,
Right.
which actually I think very fondly of, because
And a lot of people do. It really funded a lot of people to do very good work.
You know, in a sense, it was like the contemporary 1970s WPA.
Right.
It had the Works Progress Administration ethic, the notion that you could put people to work at plumbers' wages, that they could actually do improvements in their communities. So I was one of those wonderful Sita artists. We were considered to be citizens, and we considered to have value in a society. Very novel idea at this moment in time.
For artists, that's true.
Today, artists are really sort of the anathema to the country and to government in general, and I think that's really a mistake. But I was sent out to teach in the parks, and I began teaching at multiple parks across the city, and I very quickly learned that I could travel between the parks, but the young people that I taught could not, and that was a shocking experience. Even though I was from Pacoima, I came from a neighborhood that had tremendous amount of struggle between African American and Latino. I was in the East Side, and I had never seen or really understood the degree to which neighborhoods were divided. And it was at the same time of the Civil Rights Movement. Cesar Chavez was calling for the grape boycotts. We were trying to be brown and proud. We were trying to be women were trying to speak for their rights. And all of this activism was happening. And I wanted to do something about this, but I was only an artist, right? I had been trained in minimalist painting. I had learned to work with formal dialogues that basically didn't include anybody but 5 of my friends who could understand it. And I couldn't understand how I could be a relevant person if I didn't somehow make the art that would speak to Francisca and Hortensia and to my communities, and I wanted to make art that mattered to them. And so I systematically, after my graduation from the California State University at Northridge, to unlearn what I had learned and to say, how do I make this work? And when I started to do this, others started to do it too. And we needed a place to go. And so I joined forces with 2 other friends, 2 wonderful women, who are still my dearest friends over 30 years, Christina Schlesinger and Donna Deitch. Donna Deitch, who directed Desert Hearts? She directed Desert Hearts, and she received her first pennies from a National Endowment for the Arts grant we wrote at Spark to make that movie. And you were partners for a while.
Yes,
for
a goodly while.
For a number of years, actually.
Yeah.
And when we founded Spark, we were, and Christina was our, collaborator in this, and she was my best friend, and still is, I count among the closest family members I have. Mm-hmm. And she was Arthur Schlesinger's daughter. Huh. And she is a wonderful artist. So we were painters, 2 painters and a filmmaker, and we were looking for a way somehow to find a home for women who were making art, because it was still a male's world. It was still, I was working in monumental art forms in terms of giant scale mural painting, and it was just completely unheard of that a woman would lead that kind of enterprise. Monuments were for men, and men would determine those monuments, and we would be depicted as muses in them, if at all, right? Right. And I had a completely different idea about that, and also Donna was trying to make this revolutionary film. She had finished a film called Woman to Woman, mm-hmm. Which was a film about a documentary which she called about whores, housewives, and other mothers. And I had met Donna with her calling me up and saying, I want to shoot you. Can I make a film? Will you be in my film about whores, housewives, and other mothers? And I said, okay, I guess I must be another mother.
Which one am I exactly?
Which am I? And I was just coming out of being a housewife, actually. So she came out to the East Side, and she photographed. She filmed me in front of Mi Abuelita, which was a mural that was dedicated to my grandmother in Hollenbeck Park. It was the first piece I'd done in early 70s. And so I was in that film, and that's how we became great friends for many years and really connected so deeply. But what happened was that we made a space for ourselves. And then what we found was that we were making a space for many other people. And the impetus of Spark, which still continues to this day, was work that was for the working people the poor. And in other words, we thought art should be for everyone. It should not just be for those people who could afford it. It should not just be for the upper classes. I didn't want to become an entertainment for people who were just wealthy and who could afford to have, very esoteric works by me. And so I started thinking about how would my father, my stepfather, who was a factory worker, look at this image. Mm-hmm. And if it passed his eyes and he could understand it, then I was on the mark. And then I tried to get another layer of sophistication, but I was really looking for a layer of information, making, in a sense, modern day cathedrals. Mm-hmm. The Great Wall, in a sense, is a modern day cathedral, mm-hmm. in which we're teaching people through the imagery, and that it belongs to the people, and therefore really to no one.
Well, but also right. Public art. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's so different. You don't really, of course you have to go and see it, mm-hmm. although murals are quite different. They tend to pop up in your consciousness as you go through something. You know, mm-hmm. you'll go through a tunnel, there'll be a mural in it, or mm-hmm. Under a bridge, or see something on the side of a store. Mm-hmm. I have two friends who are artists in Monterey, and they were quite poor for a while, and they essentially paid their way for their daughter's, what she needed in school, and her classmates too, or food or anything, by doing a mural on the side of the market, to do a mural, and
they bartered
murals
right.
in the aquarium, which
right.
was sort of a move up, but still, it was a very interesting life for them, and very public, because now people say, oh, because everybody can still see them, mm-hmm. and it seems to me to be a very lasting, enormously important kind of public affirmation, especially a mural as long as the Great Wall,
Yes.
But how did the kids get involved? I mean, they were not necessarily brought to Spark, right?
Well, no, there was always children's program and adolescents. I mean, I had a sort of penchant for working with adolescents. I think it was like, in a sense, sort of staying 12 or 13 myself probably helped. I really can relate to adolescents. I really relate to their character. I have a harder time with little children, although I've come to appreciate them more. But I started out a high school teacher, and when I was teaching in the parks, I saw the city of Los Angeles preparing programs for preschool and elementary and then seniors, and just skipping the adolescents because they were so problematic. Mm-hmm. Because there was, particularly in the East Side, there was all these layers of gang warfare and,
right.
And difficult adolescence, and in a sense we were already writing off adolescent kids. Mm-hmm. And what I really found in the parks that I worked at, and I spent over 5 years organizing in the neighborhoods of East Los Angeles and creating the first mural teams out there. I hired the kids, I got them on programs it was very hard to convince people that these were really jobs that kids needed, or they were worth paying the kids for. But to give them a job in which they were cleaning up their neighborhood, in which they were making something beautiful that spoke to their experiences, that actually talked about what they cared about, that spoke from the voice of the community, was a really important act. It was a very empowering act for young people, and a really educative process. So I became involved in creating treaties between neighborhood groups, creating some of the first groups. My first group was called Las Vistas Nuevas, or the New View group, and they were all kids from 4 different gang groups that were from the parks I was teaching at, that I brought together with agreements that we would work together. And we painted Mi Abuelita, and we painted Hollenbeck Park, we painted Costello Recreation Center next to Estrada Courts, which then started the Estrada Courts projects. And we actually had an enormous impact in those early. We were on the front page of the LA Times, and people were saying, oh, gang members put down knives for brushes, and it was all sort of sensational. People just couldn't understand how this young woman was out there working with these gang kids. And it wasn't any big thing, really. What it was, simply, was a respectful treatment of young minds, understanding that many of them were talented, giving them the jobs they needed and the opportunity to do something positive. And not any great alchemy, not anything terribly miraculous, just a little hopeful treatment and goodwill and desire, and it worked. And that's how the Great Wall began, because always, when I had the opportunity at the Great Wall in 1974, the Army Corps of Engineers was looking at all of these concreted riverbeds and saying, uh-oh, now we need an aesthetic planning division because we've created eyesores throughout the city. We have dirt belts, and we've divided communities, and there's no more native vegetation, and let's design a park, and would you help us? By that time I was the director of the First City's Mural Program. And I had gone to the city council and asked them to help me do more murals on the east side, and not even knowing what I was doing in the city council, somebody had to tell me when the vote happened that I had won.
It is confusing sometimes, no question.
I had won. I had actually convinced the city council to fund the First City of Los Angeles Mural Program. And I was then directing murals all over the city. But what I saw was that we needed one place within the city in which we could bring different neighborhood groups, and in which we had one idea, which was that connection between us. And so this long wall in the flood control channel, to me, was perfect, because it was like creating a tattoo on the scar where the river once ran. And that meant we were like creating a narrative that went down this long, endless wall. And it gave children an opportunity to see their story in relationship to another story, in relationship to another story, and to teach them, African Americans, Latinos, young girls, gay kids, straight kids, that this story was all of our stories, and that together this really was what America was about.
I've always been curious, and I imagine people watching are curious too. How does a mural get put together? I mean, people don't go and say, gee, I think I'll paint something on this blank place, right? I mean, there's preparation, panels, is it drawn somewhere? How does a mural get put together?
No, it's a massive amount of preparation. In my process, and many artists do their works in different ways, but the process that has become Spark's process, the one that I have been working in for all these years now, over 30, is a process in which we begin with academic research. So we're doing very serious research.
So the theme of it, the images of it,
we're studying something. We're studying the environment, or we're studying the history of California or of the United States, and we're digging up things. But for example, the fair employment laws of the FTR era, Franklin Roosevelt's fair employment practices laws. Well, that doesn't mean anything except as text until you see its manifestation in the world. That actually opened up, in World War II, it opened up the aircraft industry to black women and to Latinos. And that changed dramatically their status within the society and their employability.
Right.
Because up to that point, you could say, ebony black person needed for restroom tending, right?
Right.
And before that, when that law basically made that illegal, and it made it possible for people to gain employment in these places. So the next layer after academic research is lived experience. Tell us about that experience. Were you there?
So does somebody interview people? Do you take notes?
We videotape.
Did the kids do this process as well?
Yes, that's right. The kids work on that process. Design teams run
So they
around.
interview people and get the stories that go with the history.
Right. So like, for example, somebody from the Fighting 442nd says, I was recruited out of an internment camp. And this person will say, we were the fabric of America. And he's just given us a magnificent metaphor about the Japanese fighting 442nd becoming the stripes of the American flag.
Right.
As they are the most decorated infantry group in World War II.
Right.
So we're looking at the story, we're hearing people's lived experience, then we're collecting metaphors. We talk to writers, we talk to poets. Hollywood 10 stood for 10 more and 10 more and 10 more. So then we can see it. It starts to be an image. And then there are many, many sketches and drawings, and those drawings are refined, and then finally they become what they call a maquette, which is a scale model.
Scale model. But a painting?
Sometimes we make them three-dimensionally. And then we create those to scale into blueprints, and then the blueprints are taken to the wall and transferred in giant grids. So we're
then
teaching
what you
math.
have at the wall, you have, I'm sorry.
So we're teaching math in the process too.
So then you have an outline, is that right?
Right.
that is filled in? And is it filled in, is there creativity at the wall itself?
There's never an image placed on the wall at the moment we are on the wall that's new. In other words, any mistake costs too much money.
Right.
So in other words, imagine that you put something in purple and you decide not to do that. Well, that could be a $200 mistake.
Right.
So you don't do that because it's on the blueprint on the blue line. And everybody weighs in before that.
So the model is really the decision time when you think,
and
what's this going to
people,
be and what's this going to look like?
And lots of people are in that process.
Wow.
So we ask people to come in and look at what we've drawn, and we get feedback. And today, what's wonderful about today's process is we put it online. And we have people send in images. So people right now are sending us images, and people could do that. They could go to sparkmurals.org, SPARCMURALS.org, and go into the participation on the Great Wall and tell us what we should put in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Right.
And we get beautiful images, amazing ideas from the public. And we can actually have those come into the design team.
So there's an extension going on now?
Right now we're designing the extensions.
Wow.
And the biggest plan we have right now is the restoration of the Great Wall. And this summer we'll be back with another team of young people and university students, and we'll be patching broken paint in the first 1,000 feet, which is now over 30 years old.
Wow.
And remarkably good condition considering how long it's been there and been in the rainstorms. But our goal is to bring it back to its total vibrance and to extend it. And truly my dream is that I will be standing on the side of the channel soon, watching the children of the Great Wall extend it without me. So it will be theirs. They'll be continuing it beyond my time.
Now you said gay kids and straight kids and all kinds of kids working on it. Are there images of gay people too?
Oh yeah.
That must have been a little controversial when you did it.
Very tough to get done.
Yeah.
We had advisors that were historians, and it was in 1984. And if you remember, at that time, the Briggs Amendment was very present in people's minds, and we had children of gay parents. We also had kids who were identifying gay at that point in their lives already, which was, younger. They started becoming more identified younger. And we did a whole segment on the origins of gay rights. So Harry Hayes is in the mural. The Daughters of Bilitis are in the mural. In fact, I think it's probably the only representation in Los Angeles of that early gay history.
I think that's right, because there's there's sort of an archives now that one can visit over near SC, but I think visually I don't really recall any images.
Ginsberg is in the wall, making the connection between the Jewish section and the gay section. And actually we have the Mattachine Society depicted. It's a very nice segment. It's really about the vice entrapment of the 1950s. And we made a direct relationship between that and McCarthyism.
It's a very important thing to do visually as well. Well, you haven't been, I mean, one would never identify Judith Baca as a gay activist, which is, she's an artist. But was it ever a controversial issue in your life or in your work, if people knew you were gay?
Yes, I mean, I think it was, the most difficult thing has been to walk the line, I think, between this identity politics. In a sense, it's a sort of tyranny, I think, the tyranny of identity politics. Because in a sense, I struggled to do any of my identities right. Right?
Sure.
And being a Chicana was difficult enough. Because there was a certain sort of dictate about how you would be as a Chicana, how you would look, how you would act. The same was true with early lesbian politics, in which, at the time that in the early 70s, when people were beginning to be speaking out and so forth, I worked very early on in the first organizations. which was fighting the Briggs Amendment. I mean, it had a very direct impact on my own teaching and my own ideas. The idea that gay people couldn't teach in high schools or elementary schools was really terrifying. I mean, you can imagine. I signed papers as a city employee that basically said that I had never had a gay experience or a lesbian experience. I mean, people had to sign that to work as a city employee. Right. And that was in the early 70s. And it was very close to the time in the 50s in which vice entrapment was, and the identification and registering of gay people was the norm. I mean, people forget that history. And that was all the way through the 50s.
Right.
In other words, if you moved from one house to the next, and you had been discovered to be gay, you were solicited in a bar, for example, by a police officer, which was very often the case, and particularly for men, and you were identified as being gay, then you would have to register, and basically it stopped your employment, your capacity to be employed. So when I started to put that history in the Great Wall, for one, all the ethnic historians were saying, why are you doing this? This has no relationship to this story. And it was actually a really interesting piece of scholarship, because what I did was I began to research deeply, and I knew that it had a relationship. It had a relationship to all the stories of justice, and if we were simply saying this is not a story about justice, only things about ethnicity were, then basically women couldn't be included, right? So I fought very hard, and I realized that the perfect link was the 1950s, perfect link with McCarthyism and the way that McCarthy used the accusations to name and out gay people, and the whole story of Cohen and really amazing things like
not amazing. I mean, people in the closet being the most oppressive of all.
Yes. So yes, that terrible, terrible period of time. So I made that case, and actually my advisors and the people I respected, I mean, I wanted people to believe in what I was doing and not, I wanted consensus building, which is the hardest thing to do. And in the end, people said, yes, let's do it. Let's do it. So I said, okay, we're going on a ride here, and it's going to be tough. And then when we recruited our kids, we did special sessions with the kids in which they actually did their role playing as gay teachers and straight teachers. And it was an amazing thing to watch these kids act this out.
What part does the role playing have for this work?
Well, we actually do one day a week in the classroom with the kids. So they're painting, and we have to make so much footage to get it. It's like making a movie. You have to make much footage week by week to get the piece done. But in addition to that, we're also working with the material. So what they're painting about becomes something they really deeply understand. They're crawling across the faces of giant figures, and they're learning something on a cellular level, almost visceral level, right? They're learning about the forebearers of civil rights. I mean, they know Robeson's face better than an archivist would know his face, right? They know the Harry Hayes. You could ask any of those kids. They will tell you that story because they know it. And part of the process is actually sitting in the classroom and working with this material. What did it mean to be deported in the 1930s because you were Mexican and in fact you were legal? Many people were deported who were legal.
Right. I think we've just apologized for that last year.
We just finally apologized.
Finally passed a law to apologize.
350,000 people were. Right. That's a conservative estimate. Now people say around 500,000. And so, the kids don't miss it. They walk down the wall, they go, oh, no, we deported them here in the 30s, and then we brought them back in the Sita Program in the 40s. Oh, and then in the 50s we had repatriation. We had a whole nother opening the Operation Wetback, and we brought them back because we needed them. I mean, back and forth. You can see, they can see it decade by decade unfolding in the story of the Great Wall. And the point really was justice. The point was that they began to understand how to work with this material. And so we often do these things where we assign kids different ethnicities, and they are working with an issue. And in one particular moment, we did the Briggs Amendment because it was happening. And the kids struggled with the issues of creating a jury that would decide, looking at gay teachers and straight teachers, and some people played the clergy. And it was fascinating because they had done the Holocaust. And they had learned about the Dutch and how they had pretended all to be Jewish so that they couldn't capture the Jews. And my kids, I was very proud of them that day, actually all decided to be gay teachers so that there was no way of distinguishing them. The straight teachers changed their buttons, disguised themselves, and in the role-playing undermined the whole game. Right? Very smart. And very, they really got the point that it didn't really matter. This loss for one was a loss for all. The loss of the rights of one is a loss for all. And if we have taught anything, we've taught that at the Great Wall.
So your projects as an artist go on, right?
Yes.
I mean, tell us a little bit about the projects that you've been commissioned to do. And I want to come back at the end because we are extending and refurbishing the Great Wall, and it is such an incredible project, so involving. But I want to make certain that before we run out of time, we understand more about your work as well, because you said something about the Denver airport.
Right.
So where else do we see your work?
The Denver airport is the largest digital mural that I have in public. It's
now, when you say digital mural, what does that mean?
Well, you know, going back to restore the Great Wall and now looking at legacy works as the director of the mural programs for so many years, our programs now are gone in the city, and you're probably watching the demise of murals all over our city. One of the great tragedies of Los Angeles at the moment is that the mural program has ended, that Spark has been defunded with these projects, and I think it's a terrible mistake for our city to lose these things. Another generation is not learning about the importance of this work. But what I started to do after the program ended was to really look at how we could produce new works that would not need restoration 30 years from now. And so we've been producing in new methods of technology, using computer-generated programs to actually create murals that are printed on giant substrates and then painted, for example, which speed up the process. Or outputted pieces that can be installed on the sides of buildings, which means, of course, that in the long run, in the future, they can be completely refurbished by being reprinted. And we don't have the process of needing hundreds and thousands of dollars to restore number by number, dot by dot, a mural that has been hand painted. So we've actually been generating some pretty exciting new ways of making digital work. So the Denver International piece is a work that is hand painted first, placed into the computer. Photographic information is also in it so that the land's memory can be seen. The memories come right up out of the land that's painted. It's outputted onto aluminum and installed in the airport. And if you run your card into it, I simply replace it.
Wow.
So it's a really great example of almost a luminescent bronze set of work. I also finished a piece for the Caracen Group, the Central American Resource and Education Center. I had the great pleasure of telling the families' stories of the people, what we call the migration of the Golden People. This is the people from El Salvador who came and who gave me their family photographs, told the story of the disappeared, told the story of their country at war, and why they left. And I worked with their children for 28 weeks, myself and Pete Galindo and many younger people who were leading those teams, my students leading the teams, and excavated the whole story and then created a giant digital mural, which we printed in our studios, adhered to the walls, and can replace or replicate. And it's on Hope and 7th. The other exciting thing is we've been working across distance, so that I collaborated with 4 cities with middle school children, teaching them to generate metaphors on the 50th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott.
Right.
And one of the children said, "Freedom is an empty bus." And we used their empty bus and Martin Luther King's church coming into the side of the bus, people pouring off the buses and walking rather than suffer the indignity of segregation. And that work gets produced digitally and sent back to the 4 schools in Boston, in Baltimore, in New York, and in Philadelphia. So we can work over distance. So it's very exciting work, and the great pleasure of it is that using the same belief system, one that art can come from, art is for everybody, from the poorest kids in Harlem that we worked with, that all people's ideas are important and that we can listen to them and incorporate them. That the land, in a sense, has memory, that we are playing with the memories, we're bringing the memories to fore, and that if we can bring the past into the present, perhaps we can change the future.
Well, I was thinking of that when you were talking about looking at just immigration, or the way we thought about immigrants in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and I assume as you continue the wall, the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s.
And this time right now will be one of the most important
well,
to
and
talk
how
about
we don't
now.
learn, in a sense, or we don't know how to learn, in a sense, from history, I think, because in trying to do public policy in the current day, as we do in the legislature, even when you know what has been tried, some of the problems are so large that you think, let's try another idea. Not so much that that one didn't work, but either a refinement of that or whatever. And I see things go back and forth, and almost what we learn is what doesn't work, but very rarely what does work. Because maybe nothing works perfectly and we have too high expectations. But documenting history and understanding people's place in it, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I want to be able to project on the next panel, you know, what this leads to. But sometimes it's just such a cacophony. It's beautiful, and it's voices, and it's, you know, it's the history of our city or our nation or whatever. But sometimes you just don't know how to learn from history.
Well, you know, I think, in a sense, I think that's true and not true. I think what happens is that we lose sight. In other words, we see what history teaches us, but we miss the essential lesson. The essential lesson being the underlying piece of values that we are communicating to ourselves and to the world. And that comes about from maybe the very political process itself of compromise. That it's so hard to hold to a set of values that we really believe in and see them to fruition. I mean, who can say that they have been able to do that? What bill have you ever written that you could say, this is really what I meant, right? Because I think the truth is that we could really get to what you really meant, it would work.
Well, it is interesting, the difference between saying something or enacting something and the implementation of it.
Yes.
And yet sometimes you need the word that says, you will not discriminate, and then we'll figure out later what that means.
That's right.
But I'm going to say that right now, you know. And it has, I think, made a difference. It's interesting when you're talking about the inclusion of gay people as it's sort of it's like, well, they're not like the other minorities, so that's, you know, not a part of it. I have a bill now that actually builds on a couple of rules in the schools in California that says that you can't adopt materials that reflect adversely on people on the basis of race, gender, religion, ethnicity, and I'm adding sexual orientation and gender identity. Then there's another section of the code that says you must teach California history. And when you teach California history, you must include the roles and contributions of, and here the law says, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, men, women, the labor movement, entrepreneurs. So I'm adding gay, lesbian, you know, bisexual, transgendered people. Because we're there, you just don't say that we're there.
Right.
And
well, disappearance is the greatest disrespect.
Exactly. Right. Silence is like invisibility. I mean, it's really all part of the same thing. And the inclusion that you find in our history and, you know, and make certain is reflected, seems to me to be enormously important. So what's going to be in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s? How do you figure that out?
Well, it's interesting what's rolling in. I mean, I think it's going to be enormously difficult to do. I mean, the 60s is always made me shudder a bit in terms of how do you do this thing? For one, it's a time in which I lived through as a conscious human being.
Right.
So it wasn't like sort of blurred in childhood for me. So I had this, you know, my own set of ideas. And yet, I mean, what is it? I mean, should I design something pulled out in a giant paisley or a psychedelic mess? Should we do it through the blur of drugs or some, you know, in some way? I don't know. Or should it be all in the light of the Vietnam War, or the loss of three great leaders like Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy and John F. K. You know. So what is it? How will this be depicted? And I think actually, as it's starting to fall out, it's also a time in which it's not really easy to look at ethnic groups set apart.
Well, that's a very
right.
interesting thing about it too. And you know, since we only have almost a minute left.
Oh, really?
I know, doesn't the hour go by fast? I always
fast.
think it does. I think we're going to want to show a little bit more of the work that you brought us, probably at the end of the show. And have to go, I think, to your website to keep track of how these images are developing and how the Great Wall.
We invite people to tell us what to send in. One of my favorite contributions so far is a young man who said, if you're going to do the 90s in Los Angeles, he sent me a beautiful drawing of an Aztec warrior with a leaf blower on his back. Well,
I think it is interesting the way the city has developed. I thank you so much for being on the show. I think it's just really fascinating, the contributions of all of our, you know, our folks, and you certainly are among a lot of different kinds of folks all in one. Not to mention not only your own combination, but the history that you were talking about, you know, the generations that came before you and your family and who came before us here. And I'm really glad that you were with us today. I really want you to see the Great Wall. I want you to go onto the website. I want you to understand that we're part of an enormously complex and beautiful fabric of history. So we really have to get used to it.